The late April afternoon light fell weakly through the tall windows of Thornhill Manor's drawing room, casting long shadows across faded carpet that had once been crimson but now showed the pale tracks of too many years and too little money for replacement. Eleanor Thornhill sat in her customary position near the window overlooking the garden, her grey dress blending into the worn upholstery of the chair, as though she herself were part of the room's shabby gentility, unremarkable and easily overlooked. Her hands worked mechanically at her embroidery, the needle rising and falling in steady rhythm while her mind drifted to the ledgers waiting in her father's old study, the accounts that never quite balanced no matter how carefully she stretched their diminished income. Through the partially open door to the morning room, her sisters' voices floated with crystalline clarity, and Eleanor's needle paused mid-stitch as Caroline's laugh rang out, bright and careless as bells. The assembly on Saturday, Lydia was saying with breathless excitement, would be absolutely splendid, for the Ashford heir had finally returned to take up residence at Ashford Hall after years away. And everyone said he was quite handsome and frightfully wealthy. Exactly the sort of man who might restore a family's fortunes with a single proposal. Caroline's response carried the particular smugness of a beautiful woman who had never doubted her own value, observing that with her new primrose gown and Lydia's blue silk, they would certainly catch his eye, and perhaps by summer's end one of them would be mistress of that grand estate. Eleanor's chest tightened with familiar resignation as she heard Lydia add, in a stage whisper clearly meant to carry, that it was fortunate Eleanor had already declined to attend, for it would be mortifying to have their plain elder sister standing about like a grey ghost dampening the festivities. Caroline's reply arrived swift and surgical, noting that Eleanor had never attracted attention at any assembly in the past 10 years. So what possible purpose could her presence serve now, except to emphasize by contrast how much beauty her younger sisters possessed? The embroidery hoop trembled slightly in Eleanor's hands as she listened to them dissolve into conspiratorial giggles, discussing whether Eleanor had ever even been asked to dance by anyone other than the vicar's elderly father, or that peculiar Mr. Whitmore who danced with everyone out of Christian duty. "She'll never be wanted," Caroline pronounced with casual finality. "Not by any man of consequence. So it's just as well she's settled into her role managing Mama's sick room and pretending the household accounts are somehow fascinating." Eleanor set down her embroidery with careful precision and rose from her chair, moving soundlessly toward the door leading to the garden, her reflection barely visible in the darkening window glass as she passed, a pale shadow of a woman whom the world had taught to expect nothing more than invisibility. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The candle on Eleanor's dressing table guttered in a draught from the ill-fitted window, casting nervous shadows across her bedchamber as she sat before the tarnished mirror that had belonged to her grandmother and studied the face that society had long ago deemed unremarkable. Through the wall separating her room from her sister's shared chamber, she could hear Caroline and Lydia's laughter still rippling like water over smooth stones, their voices bright with the thoughtless cruelty of women who had never known what it meant to be dismissed. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she unpinned her hair, letting the plain brown locks fall around her shoulders in waves that held neither the gold of Caroline's curls nor the lustrous darkness of Lydia's tresses. Just a middling shade that disappeared in candlelight and failed to catch the eye in sunshine. Her features stared back at her with the honesty mirrors cannot spare. A face too long for classical beauty, cheekbones too sharp, nose too prominent, mouth too wide, chin too determined for the delicate femininity that gentlemen admired in drawing rooms and ballrooms throughout the county. Only her eyes held any distinction, a clear grey that her father had once called gentle and perceptive. But what value did perception hold when set against her sister's rosy cheeks and rosebud lips that smiled so prettily at every man who glanced their way. She touched the pearls at her throat, her mother's only remaining jewelry that had not been sold to pay the debts left by her father's optimistic investments and untimely death 5 years earlier, and wondered if she would wear them on Saturday after all, if perhaps her sisters were right that her absence would serve everyone better than her presence, standing along the wall watching younger, prettier girls spin through dances she had long ago stopped hoping to join. The books stacked on her bedside table seemed to reproach her for such weakness. Volumes on philosophy and agricultural improvement and poetry that she had borrowed from the circulating library and read by candlelight after her mother had taken her evening medicine and her sisters had finally exhausted their chatter about ribbons and suitors and the glorious futures they felt certain awaited them. Eleanor had once harbored dreams herself, foolish romantic notions she had carefully buried beneath the weight of ledgers and household management and the daily reality of being 27 years old without prospects or beauty or fortune to recommend her to any man who might look past the surface and see the person she was beneath. She rose from the mirror and moved to her window, looking out over the estate grounds silvered by moonlight. The gardens her mother had once kept immaculately now overgrown and wild from lack of funds to employ sufficient staff, and she made herself a silent promise that she would attend the assembly on Saturday with dignity and tact, would hold her head high even as her sisters shone like stars, and she faded into her familiar obscurity, because if nothing else, Eleanor Thornhill possessed the stubborn pride that came from knowing her own worth, even when the world refused to acknowledge it. The assembly rooms blazed with candlelight on Saturday evening as Eleanor stepped through the entrance at precisely 7 o'clock, her sisters sweeping ahead of her like brilliant butterflies in their new gowns, while she followed in the same pale blue dress she had worn for 3 seasons, its modest cut and faded trim marking her as clearly as a sign might have declared her circumstances and her place in the social order. The large rectangular hall had been decorated with spring flowers and ribbon, musicians tuning their instruments on the raised platform at the far end, while the county's families gathered in clusters according to their stations and allegiances. The Pembrokes holding court near the refreshment tables where Mrs. Pembroke could observe every entrance and catalogue every detail for later dissection. Caroline and Lydia were immediately surrounded by young men, eager to secure their names on dance cards, their laughter rising above the general hum of conversation, while Eleanor moved quietly to her customary position along the wall, near the tall windows where she could observe without being observed, her hands folded carefully at her waist, and her expression composed into the pleasant neutrality she had perfected over years of such gatherings. She watched her sisters preen and flirt with practiced ease, noting how Caroline's primrose silk caught the light, and how Lydia's dark curls had been dressed with white roses, and she felt the familiar weight of resignation settle over her shoulders like an old shawl as she prepared herself for an evening of watching others dance, while she faded into the wallpaper and potted palms that lined the room's perimeter. It was then that she noticed the stranger standing with Mr. Pembroke near the entrance, a tall gentleman with dark hair and an air of quiet assurance that suggested he was accustomed to command, and Eleanor knew without being told that this must be Thomas Ashford returned at last to claim his inheritance and set the county's marriage-minded mothers and daughters into paroxysms of strategic planning. He was handsome in a severe way, his features too angular for softness, but striking nonetheless. And as she watched, he scanned the room with an expression of detached interest that suggested he found the assembly exactly as tedious as he had anticipated. Eleanor looked away quickly, turning her attention to a young girl standing nearby who appeared even more miserable than herself, a pale, nervous creature in an unfortunate yellow dress who kept glancing toward the dance floor with obvious longing, and Eleanor moved closer to offer a quiet word of companionship because, if nothing else, she understood what it meant to stand invisible, while the world danced on without you. She did not see Thomas Ashford's gaze pause on her as she spoke gently to the girl, did not notice how his expression shifted from boredom to something like curiosity as he observed her kindness to someone even more overlooked than herself, did not feel the weight of his attention as she made the girl smile with some small joke about the unfortunate placement of the refreshment tables requiring navigation through gauntlets of gossiping matrons. When Eleanor finally glanced back toward where he had been standing, she found him looking directly at her across the crowded room, and for one startling moment, their eyes met before she dropped her gaze in confusion, her heart beating strangely fast as she wondered what she had possibly done to attract the notice of the very man her sisters were so determined to capture. The minutes had somehow stretched and contracted until Eleanor found herself standing before Thomas Ashford at precisely 8:30 in the evening, introduced by Mr. Pembroke with an air of satisfaction that suggested he took credit for the acquaintance, and she could only manage a curtsy that felt both too deep and too shallow as she met the gaze of the man who had been watching her with such disconcerting attention. Mr. Ashford bowed with a precision that spoke of careful breeding, and said in a voice deeper than she had anticipated that he hoped she would grant him the honor of the next dance, and Eleanor felt the words lodge somewhere in her throat, because surely she had misheard. Surely he meant to ask one of the prettier girls clustered nearby who had fallen silent to observe this unexpected interaction. But he was extending his hand with patient expectation, and the musicians were beginning the opening measures of a country dance that would require them to stand opposite each other in the line, allowing for conversation between the figures, and Eleanor found herself placing her gloved hand in his and following him onto the floor in a daze of disbelief that made her stumble slightly as they took their positions. He steadied her with a touch to her elbow and asked if she was quite well, his expression one of genuine concern rather than the impatience she would have expected from a man obligated to dance with an ungraceful partner, and she managed to nod and collect herself as the dance began. And they moved through the familiar patterns she had learned years ago when her father was still alive and her prospects had seemed less completely foreclosed. During the first turn that brought them face to face, he asked if she had enjoyed Mr. Wordsworth's latest volume, and Eleanor blinked in confusion before remembering their discussion of poetry when she had spoken to the nervous girl in yellow, realizing with a start that he must have been close enough to overhear her mention of reading the lyrical ballads. She answered honestly that she found some of the pieces quite moving, though others struck her as overly simplistic, and she watched surprise flicker across his handsome features as though he had not expected such a measured, critical response from a woman at an assembly. The dance separated them and brought them back together, and this time he asked what she thought of the new methods of crop rotation being discussed in agricultural circles. And Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, because here at last was a man who wanted to talk about ideas rather than simply moving through the expected pleasantries of ballroom conversation. She told him about the innovations she had read of in one of the journals she borrowed from the library, methods that might improve yields without exhausting the soil, and she forgot to guard her words or make herself smaller as she always did in social settings, forgot that she was the plain sister in the faded dress until she saw Mrs. Pembroke staring at them with naked curiosity from her position near the refreshment tables. When the dance concluded and Mr. Ashford returned her to the side of the room, he thanked her for one of the most interesting conversations he had experienced in longer than he cared to admit, and Eleanor felt a dangerous flutter of hope take wing in her chest, even as she tried to crush it beneath the weight of all the reasons why his attention could not possibly signify anything more than a gentleman's courtesy to a lady who happened to share his intellectual interests. The carriage lurched forward into the darkness at precisely 11 o'clock, and Eleanor found herself wedged between Caroline and Lydia in the close confines of their aging vehicle as they made their way home along the rutted road from the assembly, her heart still beating with that strange, irregular rhythm that had begun when Thomas Ashford had looked at her across the crowded room and continued through their dance and conversation, that had felt more real than any interaction she could remember having in years. She was careful to keep her expression neutral and her hands folded quietly in her lap. But she knew her sisters had seen the dance and would have questions or comments or whatever form their attention might take. And she braced herself against the worn velvet seat as Caroline turned toward her with a smile that did not reach her eyes and asked in a voice dripping with false sweetness whether Eleanor had enjoyed her unexpected turn about the floor with the county's most eligible gentleman. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Lydia laughed in that high, tinkling way she had perfected for ballrooms and drawing rooms, and said that it was quite charitable of Mr. Ashford to notice poor Eleanor standing alone by the windows looking so dreadfully forlorn. And surely he had only asked her to dance out of pity because everyone knew that gentlemen of his standing and fortune could have their pick of any lady in the room and would naturally prefer someone young and pretty rather than a faded spinster in an outdated dress. Eleanor felt the words strike like physical blows, each one landing with precision on the tender hope she had been foolish enough to allow to take root during those brief moments of conversation about poetry and agriculture and ideas that mattered more than the cut of a gown or the arrangement of curls. Caroline leaned closer in the darkness and said in a voice that managed to sound both concerned and cruel that she hoped Eleanor had not read anything into Mr. Ashford's politeness, because it would be mortifying for the family if Eleanor developed expectations where none could possibly exist. And everyone knew that men like Thomas Ashford married beautiful, accomplished young women who could grace their drawing rooms and bear them healthy heirs, not plain aging women with no fortune and no prospects, who spent their time reading agricultural journals and caring for invalid mothers. Lydia added that she had overheard Mrs. Pembroke saying it was quite kind of Mr. Ashford to dance with the wallflowers and unfortunates, as it showed he had a charitable nature, and really Eleanor should be grateful for the attention, even if it meant nothing more than a gentleman's duty to make all the ladies feel included regardless of their particular disadvantages. The words kept coming in the darkness as the carriage swayed along the familiar road, and Eleanor felt the hope that had bloomed so unexpectedly in her chest begin to wither and curl in on itself like a flower touched by frost, because of course her sisters were right. Of course a man like Thomas Ashford could not possibly have any serious interest in someone like her, and she had been a fool to imagine even for a moment that his attention signified anything more than courtesy extended to a pitiable creature he had found standing alone at an assembly. "You'll never be wanted," Lydia said with casual finality as the carriage pulled up before Thornhill Manor, where all the servants had already retired for the night. Not the way Caroline and I are wanted, not the way real women are wanted by men who have choices and standards and expectations. And Eleanor climbed down from the carriage on trembling legs and made her way up to her small, cold room, where she finally allowed the tears to come in silent waves that shook her shoulders as she sat in the darkness and tried to convince herself to forget the way Thomas Ashford had looked at her when she spoke of things that mattered, and the way his voice had warmed when he thanked her for the most interesting conversation he had experienced in longer than he cared to remember. The calling card arrived at Thornhill Manor on Thursday afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, carried on the silver tray by their aging butler, whose expression betrayed nothing but whose presence in the drawing-room where Eleanor sat mending her mother's shawl suggested something unusual had occurred. And when Eleanor took the stiff cream paper and read the name Thomas Ashford engraved in elegant script at the top, she felt her hands begin to tremble in a way that made her grateful she was already seated. Mr. Ashford was waiting in the receiving room and wished to pay his respects to the ladies of the house, the butler informed them with careful formality. And Eleanor watched Caroline and Lydia exchange glances of pure disbelief before her younger sisters rose with matching expressions of calculation and smoothed their afternoon dresses, as though preparing for battle rather than a social call. Eleanor's mother, who had been resting in her chair by the window, straightened with an alertness that suggested her illness had not dimmed her understanding of what this unexpected visit might signify, and she nodded permission for the gentleman to be shown in while Eleanor sat frozen with the mending forgotten in her lap and her mind racing through all the possible reasons why Thomas Ashford would call at their modest home a full 5 days after the assembly, when surely he had forgotten their single dance and brief conversation about agriculture and poetry. He entered the receiving room with the same confident bearing she remembered from the assembly. But today he carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper that he presented to Eleanor, after greeting her mother with appropriate deference and nodding politely to her sisters, who had positioned themselves on either side of the sofa like beautiful sentries guarding territory they considered rightfully theirs. Mr. Ashford explained that he had been thinking of their conversation about the new methods of crop rotation, and had taken the liberty of bringing her a copy of Mr. Coke's recent treatise on the subject, along with a volume of Mr. Wordsworth's poems that he thought she might enjoy based on her thoughtful commentary at the assembly, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest as she accepted the books with hands that still trembled slightly, because this was not the gesture of a man acting out of mere courtesy or pity, but rather the deliberate action of someone who had listened carefully to her words and remembered them in the days since. Caroline's smile had frozen into something brittle, and Lydia's eyes had narrowed to dangerous slits as Mr. Ashford took the seat her mother indicated and proceeded to engage Eleanor in conversation about the innovations being discussed in agricultural journals, asking her opinion on specific techniques with genuine interest that suggested he valued her thoughts on matters of substance rather than simply making polite drawing-room talk. The tea arrived, and Eleanor found herself pouring with steadier hands as she explained her views on the balance between innovation and tradition in estate management, and she became so absorbed in the exchange of ideas that she almost forgot her sisters were watching with mounting fury until Caroline interrupted to ask sweetly whether Mr. Ashford would be attending the Pembroke ball in 3 weeks' time, a transparent attempt to redirect his attention that he deflected smoothly before returning his focus to Eleanor and asking whether she had read the latest essays on soil composition. Her mother watched the entire interaction with an expression Eleanor could not quite decipher, something between hope and concern, and when Mr. Ashford finally took his leave after staying for the better part of an hour, he bowed to Eleanor with particular attention and said he hoped they might continue their discussion at some future occasion, leaving her holding the precious books against her chest like a shield as her sisters turned on her the moment the door closed behind him. The oak-lined lane that marked the boundary between Thornhill and Ashford lands had become Eleanor's preferred walking path in the 2 weeks since Thomas Ashford's visit to us, not because she harboured any foolish hope of encountering him again, but rather because the solitude of the early morning hours allowed her to think without the weight of her sister's scrutiny, or the oppressive atmosphere of the manor where Caroline and Lydia had escalated their cruelty to levels that left Eleanor retreating to her room each evening with a kind of weary resignation. She set out just after dawn on a morning in mid-May, when the wildflowers were beginning to bloom in earnest along the hedgerows, primroses and bluebells creating patches of colour that might have lifted her spirits if she had not spent the previous night lying awake and replaying every moment of Mr. Ashford's visit while trying to convince herself that her sisters were right, and his attention signified nothing more than the courtesy of a well-bred gentleman toward an unfortunate acquaintance. Her worn walking boots navigated the familiar path with the ease of long practice, and she was so lost in thought that she did not immediately notice the tall figure approaching from the opposite direction until Thomas Ashford was near enough that retreating would have been obvious rudeness, and she felt her heart begin that irregular rhythm again as he smiled with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at the encounter. He greeted her with a warmth that seemed excessive for a chance meeting on a country lane, and Eleanor felt herself growing flustered as she returned his greeting and made some awkward comment about the fine weather, while her mind raced to understand why he was walking this particular path at this particular hour, when surely a man of his position had more pressing concerns than mourning constitutionals along his estate boundaries. They fell into step together with an ease that surprised her, and he asked whether she had begun reading the books he had brought, which led to a discussion of Mr. Wordsworth's poetry that gradually deepened into something more personal as they walked beneath the arching oaks that filtered the morning sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow across the path. He told her, with a hesitation that suggested the confidence of vulnerability rather than weakness, about the woman he had been engaged to marry 5 years earlier, a beautiful, accomplished lady from London who had died of fever just 2 months before their wedding, and how he had retreated to his estate afterward and buried himself in the practical work of land management because the social world with all its shallow pleasures had seemed unbearable in the wake of such loss. Eleanor found herself sharing things she had never voiced to another soul, the dreams she had abandoned of travel and study, and a life beyond the narrow confines of her role as dutiful daughter and caretaker, and the way she had learned to make herself small and invisible because it hurt less than constantly confronting the evidence of her own inadequacy in a world that measured worth by beauty and youth and the ability to charm. The conversation carried them far beyond the boundary between their estates, and when they finally turned back, Eleanor realized that something fundamental had shifted in the space between them, a recognition of shared wounds and common understanding that felt more intimate than any declaration could have been, and she walked home with the morning sun warm on her shoulders and a feeling in her chest that she was terrified to name but could no longer entirely suppress. Eleanor returned from her morning walk with Thomas Ashford feeling as though something luminous had taken root in her chest, a warmth that radiated through her limbs and made even the familiar confines of Thornhill Manor seem less oppressive. And she moved through the afternoon hours with an unguarded lightness that she did not think to conceal as she helped her mother with correspondence and arranged the flowers for the dinner table with unusual care. The dining room that evening was filled with the golden light of late spring filtering through windows that overlooked the overgrown garden, and Eleanor took her usual seat across from Caroline and Lydia, with her thoughts still half occupied by the conversation beneath the oak trees and the way Thomas had looked at her when she had spoken of her abandoned dreams, as though they were not foolish fancies, but legitimate aspirations worthy of respect and consideration. She did not notice at first the way her sisters were watching her with an intensity that suggested predators observing prey. And when Caroline asked with deceptive sweetness whether Eleanor had enjoyed her morning walk, she answered without her customary guardedness that, yes, it had been quite pleasant, and she had encountered Mr. Ashford along the boundary path where they had discussed poetry and estate management and various other matters of mutual interest. The silence that followed her words should have warned her, but she was too caught up in the memory of the morning to recognize the danger until Lydia laughed with a cruelty so sharp it seemed to cut the golden evening light into jagged pieces, and said that surely Eleanor did not imagine that a man like Thomas Ashford was genuinely interested in a woman as plain and unremarkable as herself, that everyone in the county knew he was simply being kind out of pity, or perhaps amusing himself with the attentions of a pathetic spinster, too desperate to recognize when she was being toyed with for sport. Caroline joined the assault with surgical precision, cataloguing each of Eleanor's inadequacies with the thoroughness of long practice, reminding her that she was 27 years old, with brown hair that held no luster and features so ordinary that strangers forgot her face within moments of meeting her, that she had no accomplishments worth mentioning, and no prospects beyond a lifetime of caring for their aging mother in this crumbling house. While her beautiful sisters made brilliant marriages and moved in circles Eleanor could never hope to enter, their mother attempted a weak protest, saying that perhaps Mr. Ashford did find Eleanor's conversation agreeable, but a coughing fit interrupted her defense and left her gasping for breath, while Caroline continued relentlessly, explaining that men like Thomas Ashford married women of beauty and consequence, not worn-out elder sisters with nothing to recommend them, but a modest intelligence that no man truly valued in a wife, and that Eleanor would do well to guard her heart before she made herself a laughing-stock by imagining that his polite attentions signified anything beyond common courtesy. Eleanor felt the luminous warmth in her chest solidifying into something cold and heavy as her sisters spoke, each word landing with the precision of stones thrown at glass. And she watched her reflection in the window darken as the sun set behind the overgrown garden, while Lydia delivered the final blow with a smile as beautiful as it was merciless, saying that Eleanor would never be wanted, not truly, not the way women were wanted when they possessed the qualities that inspired genuine desire rather than mere charitable tolerance. She excused herself before the tears could fall where her sisters might see them, and fled to the garden where the gathering darkness hid her shaking shoulders, and the sound of her mother's continued coughing drifted through the open windows, along with the bright laughter of Caroline and Lydia, celebrating their successful destruction of whatever fragile hope had taken root in their elder sister's foolish heart. Eleanor spent the 3 days between the cruelty of that dinner scene and Sunday morning in a state of careful numbness, armoring herself against hope with the thoroughness of long practice. And when she entered St. Michael's Church with her mother and sisters for the morning service, she kept her eyes fixed on the worn stone floor rather than risk meeting Thomas Ashford's gaze across the familiar space where the congregation arranged itself according to the invisible but inflexible hierarchies of country society. The church was a Norman structure with thick walls that held the coolness of centuries and narrow windows that filtered the late May sunlight into beams of dusty gold, illuminating the memorial tablets and the carved oak pews where families had worshipped for generations. And Eleanor took her accustomed place in the Thornhill pew, which stood in modest proximity to the front, but lacked the prominent position that wealth and consequence commanded. She was acutely aware of Thomas Ashford's presence. 3 rows ahead. And across the aisle, where the Ashford family pew occupied a place of honor near the pulpit, and she could feel his attention on her like a physical weight, even as she determinedly studied her prayer book and tried to lose herself in Vicar Whitmore's sermon about the parable of the talents, which seemed to Eleanor a particularly cruel choice of text, given her recent confrontation with her own inadequacy. Caroline and Lydia sat beside her, with expressions of satisfied tranquility, as though they had successfully accomplished some necessary task and could now rest in the certainty of a job well done. And their composed beauty in the soft church light made Eleanor feel even more acutely the truth of everything they had said about her plainness and her foolishness in imagining that a man of Thomas Ashford's position could genuinely desire her company. When the service concluded and the congregation filed out into the churchyard, where ancient yew trees cast long shadows across the weathered gravestones, Eleanor tried to maneuver herself into the protective center of a group of older women who were discussing the upcoming church fete. But Thomas moved through the dispersing crowd with the purposeful determination of a man who would not be evaded. And before she could retreat behind the shield of Mrs. Pembroke's voluble commentary on the vicar's sermon, he was at her side requesting a private word with the kind of polite firmness that made refusal impossible without obvious rudeness. Her sisters watched with barely concealed alarm as Thomas guided Eleanor away from the main gathering toward the quieter corner of the churchyard, where the oldest graves tilted at angles beneath the yew trees, and she felt her heart beating against her ribs with a force that seemed likely to betray her agitation as he turned to face her with an expression of concern that she told herself firmly was merely the solicitude of a kind man toward an unfortunate acquaintance. He asked directly why she had avoided meeting his eyes during the service, and why she had not responded to the note he had sent yesterday, requesting permission to call again at Thornhill Manor, and Eleanor found herself unable to produce any of the reasonable excuses she had prepared, her throat closing around words that would have sounded like lies even to her own ears. And in the silence that stretched between them while the sounds of the congregation's chatter drifted across the churchyard, and a blackbird sang somewhere in the branches above them, she saw understanding dawn in his face, followed by something that looked remarkably like determination, as he said with quiet intensity that he would call at Thornhill Manor that very afternoon at 2 o'clock, and he hoped very much that she would consent to speak with him. Eleanor arrived at Ashford Hall at precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon, with her heart hammering against her ribs and her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles showed white through her gloves. And as the butler led her through the entrance hall with its portraits of Ashford ancestors gazing down with expressions of stern judgment, she felt certain that she was walking toward some inevitable humiliation that would confirm everything Caroline and Lydia had said about her foolishness in imagining herself worthy of such a man's genuine regard. The library to which she was conducted was a room of considerable beauty, with floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound volumes, tall windows that overlooked parkland where deer grazed in the middle distance, and a fireplace carved from marble where a small fire burned against the coolness of the afternoon. And Thomas rose from the desk where he had apparently been attending to correspondence with an expression of such relief at her arrival that Eleanor felt momentarily disoriented by the evidence that he had genuinely been uncertain whether she would come. He dismissed the butler and requested that tea be brought, then turned to Eleanor with a directness that seemed to strip away all the conventional formalities of social discourse, as he said that he was glad she had come, because he found her withdrawal after their last meeting both puzzling and distressing, and he hoped very much that she would tell him what had occurred to cause such a marked change in her manner toward him. Eleanor stood near the fireplace with her hands still clasped before her and tried to produce some polite deflection about being merely tired or preoccupied with family matters. But the words died in her throat under his steady gaze, and when he moved closer and said with quiet intensity that he had thought they had established a friendship based on honesty and mutual respect, she felt something crack in the armor she had constructed around her bruised heart. Outside the tall windows, rain began to fall in a gentle patter against the glass, as though the weather itself was responding to the emotional tension in the room, and Eleanor found herself speaking before she could reconsider the wisdom of such vulnerability, telling him that her sisters had made it quite clear that his attentions could not possibly signify genuine interest, that she was 27 years old and plain and unremarkable in every way that mattered, and that she would be foolish to mistake common courtesy and charitable kindness for anything more substantial. She watched his face as she spoke, and saw his expression shift from confusion to understanding, and then to something that looked remarkably like anger, though she realized with surprise that the anger was not directed at her, but on her behalf. And when she fell silent, he stood looking at her for a long moment before speaking with a precision and clarity that seemed to fill the book-lined room with undeniable truth. He said that he had indeed sought her company with deliberate intention, that he found her intelligence stimulating and her character admirable and her presence essential to his happiness in ways he had not experienced since the death of his fiancée 5 years earlier, and that if she imagined his attentions were motivated by pity or kindness, she was very much mistaken, because what he felt was considerably more serious and significantly less comfortable than charitable condescension. The tea service arrived and was placed on the table between them, but neither moved to pour as he continued speaking, telling her that he valued her precisely for the qualities her sisters seemed to consider deficiencies. Her thoughtfulness and depth of understanding and lack of the artificial performance that characterized so many women of their acquaintance, and that he had hoped she might come to regard him with similar esteem if given sufficient time and opportunity to know his character. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as the rain intensified outside and the fire crackled in the marble fireplace, and she struggled to reconcile his words with the lifetime of dismissal and invisibility that had taught her to expect nothing, while somewhere deep in her chest that luminous warmth began cautiously to glow again, despite all her efforts to extinguish it. The week following Thomas Ashford's declaration in his library passed with the strange quality of a dream from which Eleanor kept expecting to wake. And yet each afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, his carriage appeared at Thornhill Manor with a reliability that gradually began to chip away at the fortress of disbelief she had constructed around her heart. And he came bearing gifts that spoke to an attention she had never before experienced in her 27 years. Not jewelry or frivolous tokens, but rather a volume of poetry they had discussed with his own notes penciled in the margins. A cutting from his greenhouse of a rare rose variety she had admired, and once a beautiful edition of an agricultural text because he wished to hear her thoughts on crop rotation strategies, given her obvious understanding of estate management from her years helping to maintain Thornhill Manor's diminished holdings. The garden became their meeting place by unspoken agreement. That bench beneath the arbor where late spring roses were beginning to bloom in profusions of pink and white that filled the air with their heavy, sweet perfume, and Eleanor's mother took to positioning herself at the drawing-room window with her needlework where she could serve as chaperone while allowing them the illusion of privacy, her thin face showing a cautious hope that Eleanor found both touching and terrifying because it meant someone else now shared her vulnerability to disappointment. Thomas spoke to her as though her opinions held weight and value, asking her perspective on matters of estate business and current political developments, and the relative merits of various authors, and the conversation stretched longer with each visit until the servants began to raise eyebrows at the impropriety of such extended calls. But he seemed utterly unconcerned with propriety, or perhaps more accurately, he seemed to consider the building of genuine understanding between them more important than the arbitrary rules governing social interaction. Caroline and Lydia watched these developments with increasing alarm that manifested in escalating cruelty during the hours when Thomas was not present to witness their venom, and they took every opportunity to undermine Eleanor's fragile confidence with observations about how unusual it was for a man to court so persistently without declaring serious intentions, how the town was beginning to gossip about her presumption in entertaining a suitor so far above her station, how everyone knew that men of means often amused themselves with the attention of plain women before ultimately choosing beautiful wives. Eleanor tried to shield herself against their poison, but found it seeping into her thoughts during the quiet hours of night, when she lay awake wondering if perhaps they were right, if perhaps Thomas was simply a kind man who had not yet realized how awkward it would be to extricate himself from an association that had gone on longer than he intended. And yet each afternoon when his carriage appeared and she saw his face light with genuine pleasure at the sight of her, those doubts retreated like shadows before candlelight, though they never entirely disappeared, but rather lurked at the edges of her newfound happiness, waiting for any opportunity to reclaim their territory. The Pembroke Ball on the evening of May the 29th was among the most significant social events of the county calendar, and held at the grand estate 3 miles north of Thornhill Manor, and Eleanor entered the candle-lit ballroom at 8:30, wearing the same gown she had worn to the assembly where she first met Thomas, with the knowledge that everyone present would recognize it as evidence of her family's reduced circumstances. But this time she wore it with something approaching confidence, because Thomas had sent a note that morning saying he would particularly look forward to their dances that evening, with a specificity that suggested his attendance was primarily motivated by her presence. The ballroom was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting pools of golden light across polished floors, where couples were already moving through the figures of a country dance, and Caroline and Lydia had positioned themselves strategically near the refreshment table, where they could display their new gowns of blue silk and pink satin, respectively, while surveying the room with the calculating assessment of predators identifying prey. And Eleanor saw Mrs. Pembroke holding court near the musicians, with her usual cluster of gossips, gathered close like pigeons awaiting crumbs of scandal. Thomas arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as she saw him scan the room until his gaze found her standing near the tall windows that overlooked the terrace. And he crossed directly to her side, without pausing to greet other acquaintances, despite the obvious social impropriety of such focused attention, and he bowed over her hand with his eyes never leaving her face as he requested the honor of the next dance, in a voice loud enough that several nearby guests turned to observe the exchange, with expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval. They moved on to the floor for a waltz that had just been announced, and Eleanor was acutely conscious of the stares following them, and the whispers being exchanged behind fans and gloved hands. But Thomas seemed entirely unconcerned as he placed his hand at her waist with a proprietary confidence that sent warmth flooding through her, despite the anxiety knotting in her stomach. He danced with her for that waltz, and then remained at her side during the interval, and claimed her again for the next set, in a display of marked preference that was nothing short of scandalous, and Eleanor saw Caroline and Lydia watching with expressions of barely concealed fury, while Mrs. Pembroke's eyebrows had climbed so high they nearly disappeared into her elaborate coiffure. It was during the third dance when Eleanor overheard two gentlemen standing near the edge of the floor, one of them saying, in a voice he clearly thought too quiet to carry, that Ashford must be amusing himself with charitable attention to the plain Thornhill girl, because no man of his standing would seriously consider such an unremarkable creature, and Eleanor felt her steps falter as the familiar shame washed through her. But before she could respond, Thomas had heard the comment as well, and the music had ended, and he was turning with deliberate purpose toward the speaker. What followed happened so quickly that Eleanor barely had time to process it, but Thomas approached the gentleman with an expression of cold fury, and said in a voice that carried across the suddenly quiet ballroom that he would thank the gentleman to speak respectfully of the woman who held his deepest admiration and regard, and that if anyone present doubted the seriousness of his intentions toward Miss Eleanor Thornhill, they would do well to prepare themselves for a wedding announcement in the very near future. The ballroom fell into a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear her own heart hammering in her chest, and she saw shock register on every face turned in their direction, including Caroline and Lydia, who stood frozen near the refreshment table with expressions of absolute horror. And Thomas returned to her side and took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture of such public claim that there could be no mistaking his meaning. Eleanor woke the morning after the Pembroke ball in a state of such emotional tumult that she felt almost feverish, her mind replaying Thomas's public declaration over and over until she could scarcely believe it had truly happened, rather than being some elaborate dream conjured by her desperate longing. And she dressed with trembling hands in a simple morning gown of pale green muslin, while downstairs she could hear the sounds of the household stirring and her mother's soft voice speaking to one of the maids, and notably absent were the usual morning sounds of Caroline and Lydia's chatter, which suggested they were keeping to their rooms in the aftermath of last night's humiliation. At precisely 10 o'clock, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel drew Eleanor to the morning-room window, where she saw Thomas descending from his curricle with an expression of such purposeful determination that her heart began to race with a wild hope she still did not entirely dare to trust. And within moments the maid was announcing Mr. Ashford with a barely suppressed smile that suggested the entire household staff had heard of the previous evening's events and had drawn their own conclusions about the purpose of this morning call. Thomas entered the morning room where Eleanor stood with her mother, who had positioned herself near the fireplace with her needlework in a pose of studied casualness that fooled no one, and he bowed first to Mrs. Thornhill with perfect courtesy before turning to Eleanor with eyes that held such warmth and certainty that she felt her breath catch in her throat as he requested the honor of a private audience with her. Her mother rose with a knowing smile that transformed her thin face into something approaching beauty and murmured something about needing to speak to the housekeeper before departing with a rustle of skirts. And then Eleanor was alone with Thomas in the quiet morning light that streamed through the tall windows and illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air between them. He crossed the room to stand before her and took both her hands in his with a familiarity that would have been shocking mere weeks ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. And he said her name with such tenderness that she felt tears begin to prick at her eyes, even before he began to speak. The words she had never believed she would hear, directed at herself. He told her that from the moment he first observed her kindness to that wallflower girl at the assembly, he had recognized in her a quality of genuine compassion and intelligence that was rare in any society, but particularly rare among women who had been taught to value only beauty and accomplishment, and that with each subsequent encounter his admiration and regard had deepened into something far more profound, until he found himself unable to imagine a future that did not include her constant presence at his side. He spoke of how her thoughtful observations on estate management had impressed him with their practical wisdom, how her knowledge of literature and current affairs had provided him with intellectual companionship he had not experienced since the death of his former fiancée 5 years prior, and how her quiet dignity in the face of her sister's cruelty had demonstrated a strength of character that moved him beyond measure. Then he released one of her hands to draw from his waistcoat pocket a ring set with a deep blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that he explained had belonged to his grandmother, who had been known throughout the county for her intelligence and compassion, and he asked with his voice trembling slightly whether Miss Eleanor Thornhill would do him the very great honor of becoming his wife. Eleanor felt as though she were standing outside herself, watching a scene from a novel, as she looked down at the sapphire ring, now encircling her 4th finger, where Thomas had placed it with hands that had trembled slightly, despite his assured manner. And she had said yes through tears that blurred her vision and made her voice break on the single syllable, while he had drawn her into an embrace that was perhaps not entirely proper, but felt more right than anything she had ever experienced in her 27 years of quiet resignation. They stood together in the morning room, bathed in June sunlight for several moments, before Thomas released her and said with a purposefulness that brooked no argument that he wished to announce their engagement immediately to her family, and Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of her sisters learning this news. But Thomas's steady presence at her side gave her courage she had never possessed before this remarkable morning. He opened the door and requested that the maid summon Mrs. Thornhill and her daughters to the drawing-room with a tone of authority that sent the girl scurrying to comply, and Eleanor walked beside him down the familiar corridor to the room where just weeks ago she had overheard Caroline and Lydia mocking her plainness, and declaring that she would never be wanted by any man of consequence, and the bitter irony of returning to that same space as Thomas Ashford's betrothed was not lost on her. Her mother arrived first with an expression of such radiant joy that Eleanor knew she had already guessed the purpose of this gathering, and she embraced her daughter with a fierceness that belied her usual frailty, while murmuring blessings and expressions of happiness into Eleanor's hair. And then Caroline and Lydia entered with faces that showed annoyance at being summoned so peremptorily, until they saw Eleanor standing close beside Thomas and noticed the ring glinting on her finger, and their expressions transformed into something between shock and fury. Thomas wasted no time on preamble, but announced with clear, deliberate emphasis that he had just had the very great honor of securing Miss Eleanor Thornhill's acceptance of his proposal of marriage, and that he hoped her family would share in his happiness at this union. And the silence that followed was so profound that Eleanor could hear the clock on the mantelpiece ticking and a bird singing in the garden beyond the window. Caroline recovered first and said in a voice that shook with barely suppressed rage that surely there must be some mistake, because Eleanor could not possibly have attracted the serious attention of a gentleman of Thomas's standing, and Lydia added with a cruel laugh that perhaps he was confused about which sister he meant to propose to, and Eleanor felt the familiar shame beginning to rise until Thomas stepped forward with an expression of such cold fury that both sisters actually took a step backward. He said in a voice that carried the weight of absolute conviction that he had never been more certain of anything in his life than he was of Eleanor's worthiness to become his wife, and that he found it remarkable that her own sisters could be so blind to the qualities of intelligence, compassion, and genuine goodness that made her superior to every other woman of his acquaintance, including and especially those who possessed only the superficial advantages of conventional beauty. He continued by observing that he had witnessed their treatment of Eleanor over the past weeks, and found it contemptible that sisters who owed their continued residence in genteel society to Eleanor's management of their reduced household and her sacrifice of her own needs for theirs should repay her with such vicious cruelty. And he assured them that, as his wife Eleanor would command the respect due to her position and character, and that he would not tolerate any future behavior that failed to recognize her true worth. The 2 weeks following Thomas's devastating rebuke of her sisters passed for Eleanor in a dreamlike haze of transformation that felt at times so surreal she would catch herself glancing down at the sapphire ring on her finger simply to confirm that she had not imagined the entire miraculous turn her life had taken. And the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was not the ring itself, nor even Thomas's continued devoted attention, but rather the complete reversal in how she was now treated by the very society that had previously rendered her invisible, or worse. The first and most significant evidence of this shift came just 3 days after the engagement announcement, when Mrs. Pembroke herself called at Thornhill Manor, ostensibly to congratulate Eleanor, but clearly also to satisfy her considerable curiosity and perhaps to secure some social advantage by demonstrating early support for the future Mrs. Ashford, and the older woman who had witnessed countless interactions where Eleanor had been overlooked or dismissed, now addressed her with a deference that bordered on obsequious, while remarking repeatedly on qualities she claimed always to have noticed, including Eleanor's excellent management of her reduced household and her superior understanding of literature and current affairs. Thomas insisted on accompanying Eleanor to the modiste in town to commission her trousseau, an undertaking that would normally have been managed by female relatives, but which he declared himself determined to oversee because he wanted to ensure she had everything befitting her new position as mistress of Ashford Hall, and the dressmaker who had previously given Eleanor only perfunctory attention while lavishing care on Caroline and Lydia's orders, now fussed over her with an enthusiasm that would have been amusing had it not been so revealing of the mercenary calculations that governed social interactions. Caroline and Lydia were obliged by propriety to participate in the wedding preparations, despite their obvious anguish at doing so, and Eleanor observed with a mixture of satisfaction and genuine pity how diminished they appeared now that the dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted, for while they remained conventionally beautiful, that beauty no longer commanded the automatic social currency it once had now that Eleanor possessed what they had always assumed would be forever beyond her reach. Thomas's family descended upon the county to meet his chosen bride, including his married sister, Mrs. Harriet Langley, who had travelled from Derbyshire with her husband and 3 young children, and Eleanor had approached this meeting with considerable trepidation, fearing that his relatives would share the wider society's bafflement at his choice. But Harriet had embraced her with genuine warmth, and declared that she had never seen her brother so content, and that any woman who could accomplish that transformation, was welcome as a sister, regardless of whether she possessed a beautiful face or a large dowry. The town's attitude toward Eleanor underwent a similar evolution as Thomas's unwavering devotion and public displays of affection made it clear that this was no arrangement of convenience or charitable gesture, but rather a genuine love match, and she found herself invited to social events from which she had previously been excluded, while matrons who had never before acknowledged her now sought her opinion on various matters and positioned their unmarried sons and nephews to curry favor with the future Mrs. Ashford. Through all of this, Eleanor felt herself gradually shedding the protective armor of resignation she had worn for so many years. And though moments of doubt still surfaced, particularly late at night, when old patterns of self-deprecation would whisper their familiar poison, Thomas's steady presence and his evident pride in her company provided an antidote to those internal voices that had for so long told her she would never be wanted. Eleanor sat in the library at Ashford Hall week before her wedding day, the same room where Thomas had first dismantled her carefully constructed defenses and forced her to acknowledge that his interest was genuine. And now, as afternoon light slanted through the tall windows and illuminated the leather spines of hundreds of books that would soon be hers to read at leisure, she felt the familiar flutter of doubt rising in her chest, despite all the evidence of these past weeks that should have convinced her of her own worthiness. Thomas had stepped out momentarily to speak with his steward about some matter concerning the tenants, and in his absence Eleanor found herself cataloguing the ways she might prove inadequate to the role she was about to assume, for mistress of Ashford Hall was a position that commanded respect and required capabilities she was not certain she possessed, and though she had managed her mother's reduced household with competence for years, that was a far different matter from overseeing an estate of this size, with its numerous servants and social obligations and expectations. When Thomas returned, he must have read something in her expression, because he crossed the room immediately and took both her hands in his, drawing her up from the chair where she had been sitting, and asked with such gentle concern what troubled her that she found herself confessing fears she had thought to keep hidden. Admitting that she sometimes woke in the night, convinced that he would eventually see what her sisters had always seen, and realize he had made a terrible mistake in choosing her. He was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her wish to look away, and then he said, in a voice that carried absolute conviction, that he needed her to understand something of vital importance, and he led her to the window that overlooked the gardens and the parkland beyond, stretching away toward the woods that marked the boundary of his property. He told her that when he had lost Margaret 5 years ago, he had believed himself incapable of loving again, and that he had in fact convinced himself he preferred solitude to the risk of such pain. But then he had seen Eleanor at the assembly and been struck not by any superficial attraction, but by the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, despite being so clearly overlooked and dismissed by those around her, and in the weeks since he had come to realize that what he felt for her was deeper and more substantial than what he had experienced even in his youth, because it was founded not on the unstable ground of physical attraction or social advantage, but on genuine admiration for her character and mind and spirit. He spoke of the future he envisioned, of children who would have her intelligence and compassion, of growing old together in this house, surrounded by books and meaningful conversation, of building a life that defied the shallow values of a society that measured worth by beauty and fortune rather than substance. And as he spoke, Eleanor felt the knot of anxiety in her chest gradually loosening. She turned from the window to face him fully, and found him watching her with such tenderness that she felt tears prickling at her eyes, and when he drew her close in an embrace that would have scandalized the arbiters of propriety, she rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beating of his heart, and felt herself finally believing that she was wanted, not despite her plainness, but because of everything she truly was beneath the surface that society deemed unremarkable. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned with the kind of crystalline perfection that seemed almost orchestrated by Providence itself. The late June sky stretching overhead in flawless azure, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of roses and honeysuckle through the open windows of Thornhill Manor, where Eleanor stood in her bedchamber being dressed by her mother and the lady's maid, Thomas, had thoughtfully sent from Ashford Hall to assist with the preparations. And as the maid fastened the last of the tiny pearl buttons running down the back of Eleanor's gown of ivory silk, overlaid with delicate lace that had cost more than anything she had ever owned in her entire 27 years, she caught sight of her reflection in the looking-glass and experienced a moment of such profound disorientation that she had to steady herself against the dressing-table. The woman looking back at her was not beautiful by the standards that governed such judgments, for her features remained as unremarkable as they had always been, and her brown hair, though dressed with care, would never possess the lustrous gold of Caroline's, nor the rich auburn of Lydia's. But something in her expression had altered so fundamentally that she appeared almost transfigured, a radiance emanating from within that no cosmetic art could manufacture, and her mother standing beside her with tears streaming freely down her lined face, whispered that Eleanor's father would have been so very proud to see this day. By 11:30, the carriage arrived to convey them the short distance to St. Michael's Church, the same building where just weeks ago Eleanor had sat in her family's pew, feeling Thomas's concerned gaze upon her, and fighting the urge to flee from hope itself. And now, as the carriage rounded the final curve in the road, she could see that the churchyard was crowded with carriages and townspeople who had gathered to witness what had become the most discussed wedding in the county's recent memory, the shocking union between wealthy Thomas Ashford and plain Eleanor Thornhill that had confounded expectations and rewritten the social calculus by which worth was typically measured. Inside the church, the ancient stone walls were decorated with garlands of white roses and trailing ivy, and every pew was filled with faces both familiar and less so. The assembled guests representing a cross-section of county society, from the highest to the most modest. For Thomas had insisted that the celebration be open to all who wished to attend, rather than restricted to only the elite circles that typically monopolized such occasions. Eleanor's mother took her place in the front pew beside Harriet Langley and her husband, while Caroline and Lydia sat stiffly on the opposite side, their beautiful faces composed into expressions of forced civility that could not quite conceal the bitterness beneath, and Eleanor felt a fleeting moment of something that was not quite pity, but perhaps its more distant cousin, as she recognized that they would be forever imprisoned by the very values that had briefly elevated them and ultimately failed them so completely. Then the vicar nodded, and the small organ began to play, and Eleanor started down the aisle on unsteady legs, her eyes finding Thomas where he stood at the altar, looking impossibly handsome in his dark coat, with his grey eyes fixed upon her with such fierce devotion that she felt her remaining doubts evaporate like morning mist under sunlight. And when she reached him and placed her hand in his, she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones with absolute certainty. The ceremony itself passed in a dreamlike procession of sacred words and solemn vows, but Eleanor would remember with perfect clarity the moment when Thomas spoke his promises to her, for rather than simply repeating the traditional phrases, he paused and added, in a voice meant for her alone, but loud enough that those nearest could hear, that he pledged himself to the woman of intelligence and compassion and quiet strength who had captured his admiration and his heart, and that he considered himself the most fortunate of men to have recognized what others in their blindness had overlooked. The wedding breakfast at Ashford Hall unfolded in the grand hall that had been decorated with such lavish attention that Eleanor felt momentarily overwhelmed by the transformation of the familiar space into something approaching fairy tale splendor, the long tables draped in pristine white linen and adorned with arrangements of roses and peonies in shades of cream and palest pink, while sunlight streamed through the tall windows and cast patterns of gold across the polished floors, where guests moved in swirls of silk and superfine wool, their voices creating a pleasant hum of conversation punctuated by laughter that held none of the cruel edge Eleanor had learned to recognize in her years of being the subject rather than the participant in social gatherings. She sat beside Thomas at the head table, with her mother on her other side, looking happier than Eleanor had seen her in years, the illness that had so weakened her seeming to retreat in the face of such profound joy. And when Eleanor caught sight of Caroline and Lydia seated at a table near the back of the room, their beautiful faces tight with barely suppressed fury, she felt not triumph exactly, but rather a kind of peaceful satisfaction that came from knowing their power to wound her had been permanently revoked. The meal proceeded through multiple courses of remarkable quality. The food prepared by Thomas's excellent cook, who had outdone herself for the occasion, and Eleanor found herself actually tasting what she ate, rather than simply moving it around her plate, as she had done at so many social functions where anxiety had stolen her appetite, and she was laughing at something Harriet Langley had just said, when Thomas rose from his seat, and the room gradually quieted as the guests turned their attention toward him with the expectation of the traditional toast. He stood with his wine-glass raised, and his other hand resting lightly on Eleanor's shoulder in a gesture of possession and tenderness combined. And he began by thanking all those who had come to celebrate this day with them. But then his tone shifted, and he said that he wished to speak more specifically about the woman he had just married. For he knew that their union had surprised many who had perhaps wondered what had drawn him to a woman the world had deemed unremarkable. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush hot and her stomach clench with apprehension, but Thomas continued with his eyes fixed on her face and his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room as he enumerated the qualities he had found in her, speaking of her intelligence that had engaged his mind in ways he had forgotten were possible, her compassion that extended even to those who had treated her unkindly, her quiet strength that had sustained her family through years of difficulty without complaint or self-pity, her dignity in the face of dismissal that had first caught his attention and continued to command his deepest admiration. And he said that he considered any man a fool who measured a woman's worth by the regularity of her features or the fashion of her gowns, rather than by the content of her character and the quality of her soul. The room had gone absolutely silent, and Eleanor was aware of tears streaming down her face as Thomas concluded by saying that he was the most fortunate of men to have recognized what others had overlooked, and that he pledged to spend his life ensuring that Eleanor never again doubted her own value. And when he sat down, the room erupted in applause, and Eleanor turned to him with such gratitude and love that she felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it, while across the room she glimpsed Caroline and Lydia sitting rigid and pale as their humiliation was witnessed by everyone who had once heard them declare that their plain sister would never be wanted by any man of consequence. 2 years had passed since that perfect June wedding day, and on an autumn evening when the last golden light slanted through the tall windows of Ashford Hall's nursery, Eleanor sat in the cushioned rocking chair that Thomas had commissioned specially for her comfort with their infant daughter, Charlotte, cradled against her chest, the baby's tiny fist curled around Eleanor's finger with a grip that still amazed her in its fierce determination, and she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone in such a relatively brief span of time. She was no longer Eleanor Thornhill, the plain, overlooked sister resigned to invisibility and service, but rather Eleanor Ashford, mistress of one of the county's finest estates, wife to a man whose devotion had never wavered through the ordinary trials and extraordinary joys of their marriage, and mother to this perfect child who possessed her father's grey eyes, and what Thomas insisted was her mother's gentle disposition, though Eleanor privately thought it far too early to make such determinations. The house that had initially intimidated her with its size and elegance had become truly hers through the gradual process of establishing routines and making decisions about everything from menu planning to tenant relations. And she had discovered within herself capabilities she had never suspected, managing the household accounts with an efficiency that impressed even Thomas's steward, and involving herself in the welfare of the estate families in ways that had earned her genuine respect and affection from people who had initially viewed her with the same skepticism that had colored so much of her earlier life. Thomas entered the nursery quietly, his footsteps soft on the thick carpet, and came to stand beside the rocking chair, with his hand resting gently on Eleanor's shoulder as he gazed down at their sleeping daughter with an expression of such tender pride that Eleanor felt her heart swell with the same overwhelming love that still caught her by surprise in unguarded moments. They had received a letter that morning from Eleanor's mother reporting that Caroline had finally accepted a proposal from a clergyman of modest means after 2 failed London seasons and increasing desperation, while Lydia remained at home growing more bitter with each passing year, and though Eleanor felt genuine sorrow for the unhappiness her sisters had created for themselves through their cruelty and shallow values, she could not deny a certain satisfaction in knowing that the qualities they had mocked in her had proven far more valuable than the beauty they had prized so highly in themselves. The community that had once overlooked her now sought her opinions and company, with even Mrs. Pembroke having become something of an ally after witnessing the obvious success and happiness of the Ashford marriage, and Eleanor had slowly learned to accept invitations and engage in social activities without the constant anxiety that had once plagued such occasions, though she remained far more comfortable in intimate gatherings than grand assemblies. As Charlotte stirred and made the small mewing sounds that preceded weighing, Thomas lifted the baby from Eleanor's arms with practiced ease and held her against his chest while Eleanor rose and stretched muscles stiff from sitting, and she moved to stand beside her husband and daughter at the window overlooking the grounds that had become so dear to her, the familiar landscape now associated with happiness rather than the painful yearning of her earlier years. Thomas turned to her with that look that still made her breath catch, the one that told her without words that she was cherished and valued and seen in all her imperfect humanity, and he said softly that he had been thinking about how their lives had intersected at precisely the right moment, how he might have remained imprisoned by grief over his lost fiancée, and she might have resigned herself to permanent invisibility, if fate had not brought them together at that county assembly where he had noticed her kindness to a wallflower girl, and been intrigued enough to look beyond the surface that others found so unremarkable. Eleanor reflected that evening as she stood with Thomas and Charlotte at the nursery window, how the journey from invisible sister to beloved wife and mother had taught her truths that she now carried like precious gems in her heart, lessons about worth and recognition that she hoped someday to pass along to her daughter so that Charlotte would never endure the years of dismissal and self-doubt that had marked her own youth. She thought about the girl she had been just over 2 years ago, sitting by the window at Thornhill Manor in her grey dress and believing herself destined for permanent obscurity, and she marveled at how completely her circumstances had transformed not through any change in her physical appearance, which remained as unremarkable as it had ever been, but rather through the simple radical act of being truly seen by someone who valued what others had overlooked. Thomas had given her far more than his name and his fortune, though both had certainly improved her material comfort beyond anything she had imagined possible in those bleak days before the assembly. He had given her the gift of his perception, the revolutionary experience of being recognized as worthy, not despite her plainness and quiet nature, but in some ways because of the qualities that accompanied them, the depth and compassion and steadiness that more celebrated beauties often lacked because their surface attractions had never required them to develop inner resources. She had learned that cruelty said far more about those who inflicted it than those who endured it, that Caroline and Lydia's mockery had reflected their own fearful shallowness rather than any genuine inadequacy in herself, and while she genuinely grieved for the bitterness that continued to poison their lives, she no longer carried any responsibility for their unhappiness or any lingering wound from their words. The community that had once overlooked her now sought her guidance and friendship, and she had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed for managing complex household operations and supporting tenant families and navigating social situations that had once terrified her. And each small success built upon the previous ones, until she had become in reality the capable, respected woman that Thomas had somehow perceived in her from their very first conversation. She looked down at Charlotte sleeping peacefully in Thomas's arms and felt fierce, protective love surge through her, a determination that her daughter would grow up knowing her own value regardless of whether the world immediately recognized it, that she would have the confidence Eleanor had lacked to trust her own worth even in the face of dismissal. Thomas met her eyes over their daughter's head and smiled with that particular warmth that still made her breath catch even after 2 years of marriage, and she knew without words that he understood what she was thinking, because he always seemed to understand, that mysterious alchemy of true partnership that had proven even more precious than she had dreamed during those tentative early days of their courtship. The autumn evening deepened outside the window, and Eleanor felt profound gratitude wash over her, not just for the obvious blessings of loving husband and healthy child and beautiful home, but for the harder-won gifts of self-knowledge and confidence and the understanding that it had never been too late for her life to begin, that the years of waiting and loneliness had not been wasted, but rather had shaped her into someone capable of receiving and returning the kind of love that now filled her days with meaning and joy beyond measure.